Marcus Thompson sat behind his sleek mahogany desk, his fingers lightly drumming against the surface as he stared at the picture of his first car hanging on the wall in front of him. The memories flooded back as he thought of how far he had come from the young man with nothing but ambition to the CEO of a booming company. But as his business grew, so did the distance from the very people he aimed to serve. He had built his empire with the belief that everyone deserved a chance, but he had begun to notice something troubling. There was a pattern at his partnered car dealership. One, he could no longer ignore customers who looked like him were consistently treated differently. There was an underlying air of superiority among the staff that was hard to miss, and Marcus couldn't just sit back and let it slide. His decision was made. It was time to go undercover. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, never one to shy away from confronting issues head-on, but he also knew that some problems needed to be seen from a different perspective, and this time he would see it firsthand. He would experience what his customers went through, what others who didn't look like the typical buyer endured. So he set the plan in motion that afternoon. Dressed in a simple black hoodie, a pair of worn jeans, and sneakers, Marcus transformed from a polished CEO to an anonymous figure among the crowds. He had every intention of walking into that dealership like any other person looking to buy a car, but with the stealth of a man on a mission. As he pulled into the dealership's parking lot, the first thing he noticed was the glaring contrast between the shiny new cars on display and the way the staff was engaged with the customers who had arrived before him. There was a group of well-dressed white individuals laughing with one of the salespeople as they inspected a high-end model, while Marcus stood a few feet away taking in the scene. It didn't take long to realize that he was invisible. No one even bothered to acknowledge his presence. It was as if he didn't belong here. He was a ghost in a room full of shiny cars and eager customers. But the truth was, he wasn't like everyone else. He had the power to change this, and he was determined to expose the inequality that lurked behind the polished glass walls of this dealership. After a few moments of standing there trying to get someone's attention, Marcus decided to approach a salesperson who was adjusting the price tag on a luxury sedan. She was focused on her task, unaware that someone had approached. Until Marcus cleared his throat, she looked up with a faint smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze flicked over him, quickly sizing him up before she returned her attention to the car in front of her. Without a word, Marcus could feel the subtle dismissal. It was clear she wasn't interested in helping him as much as she was interested in helping the next customer who looked like they had money to spend. Still, he asked about the car's features and price, trying to push through the awkwardness of the situation, but the responses were short and cold. It was obvious that he wasn't going to get the VIP treatment. She had no time to explain or engage beyond the basic facts. No effort to connect, no real interest in making a sale with him. Her focus was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that wasn't Marcus Thompson. He could feel the sting, but he hid it well. He knew better than to let his emotions show. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him frustrated. Instead, he decided to observe further. He moved through the dealership, slowly taking in the way staff treated others. He watched as they fawned over the white customers, paying attention to every little detail, smiling, offering coffee, guiding them through test drives. While he stood there feeling like he had been forgotten, no one came to offer him help. No one asked if he was interested in anything or if he needed more information. No one seemed to care enough to even look his way, as if his presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. The more he watched, the more infuriating it became. But Marcus held his ground, knowing that this moment would give him the ammunition he needed. He wasn't leaving just yet. He was here to learn the truth, and no amount of dismissive behavior was going to send him away without a fight. Marcus stood there watching the scene unfold around him. The staff moved with practiced ease as they interacted with the other customers, each one more eager than the last to make a sale. But when they glanced his way, it was as if he were invisible. They looked through him, not at him, a feeling he knew all too well growing up. But he wasn't about to let it affect him now. He had learned long ago to mask his emotions and maintain control. This was no different. He was here for a reason, and he wasn't about to let their ignorance dictate the outcome. The more he observed, the more he could feel his anger building, but it was not the type of anger that led to rash decisions. This was calculated, this was purposeful. He needed them to see him for who he was. He needed to show them just how wrong they were in their assumptions about him. He could already feel the wheels turning in his mind, the plan taking shape. If they wanted to ignore him now, he would make them remember him forever. He would give them a reason they couldn't dismiss, a reason they couldn't forget. After standing by for what felt like an eternity, he decided it was time to take action. He walked over to a nearby luxury model, a high-end sports car that was clearly the centerpiece of the dealership. Its sleek design and powerful engine, a stark contrast to the mundane vehicles he had been offered so far. He knew it was a risk to show interest in a car so expensive, especially with the way the staff had treated him, but if he was going to make a point, now was the time to do it. He ran his fingers gently over the car's polished surface, allowing the staff to see that he wasn't some casual observer, but a serious buyer who knew exactly what he wanted. A moment later, one of the salespeople, a young woman, approached him. She had been too busy with another customer to notice him earlier, but now she was making her way over with a forced smile. She stopped a few feet away from him, her body language stiff, as if she were unsure of how to handle him. He looked at her directly, his gaze steady, as he asked about the car's performance, the features, and the price. She hesitated for a second before launching into her pitch, but there was no warmth in her words, no real enthusiasm, just the robotic delivery of someone who had seen too many faces to care anymore. Marcus could sense the distance between them. He could tell she was already assuming he wasn't serious, that he didn't have the resources to afford such a car, but he wasn't going to let her off that easily. He pushed further, asking more detailed questions about the car's specifications, testing her knowledge, and pushing her to prove she knew what she was talking about. But the longer the conversation went, the more he felt her annoyance growing. It was clear she didn't appreciate being challenged by someone who she had already pegged as unworthy of her time. It wasn't long before she finished her brief answers and excused herself to attend to a customer across the showroom, a customer who had entered shortly after him but had been greeted with far more enthusiasm. Marcus couldn't help but shake his head at the absurdity of it all. It was as if she had decided that the other customer was worth more of her time based solely on his appearance and assumed status. He stood there for a moment, letting the moment sink in before turning on his heel and walking toward the exit, but not before one final glance at the staff and the way they had turned their attention to yet another customer who didn't look like him. As Marcus made his way to the door, he could feel the weight of the experience settling in his chest. He knew this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but now he had proof. Now he could do something about it, and he had the power to bring change, and today was the beginning of that change. The staff had no idea who they had just dismissed, but Marcus wasn't about to let them forget him, not ever. As Marcus walked toward the door, he could hear the chatter of the staff behind him. None of them seemed to notice him leaving or even care. They were too busy attending to their chosen customers. But Marcus didn't mind. He didn't need them to notice him, not yet. He had gotten what he came for. The truth was right there in front of him, clear as day, and now he had the evidence to prove it. He stepped outside into the cool air and took a deep breath as he leaned against the building, letting the reality of what he had just experienced sink in. It was more than just frustrating, it was painful to witness the very thing he had spent so many years fighting against, yet here it was staring him in the face in a place where customers were supposed to be treated equally. It wasn't just a business problem, it was a reflection of a much larger issue, one that needed to be addressed head-on. He pulled out his phone and started composing the email he had been thinking about for the last few minutes. As his fingers moved across the screen, he typed quickly, his thoughts flowing faster than he could keep up with. The words were sharp but precise. He detailed the entire experience from the moment he stepped into the dealership to the way he was completely ignored and dismissed by the staff. He didn't hold back, he didn't sugarcoat anything. He wanted them to understand the severity of what had just occurred, and he wanted to make sure the message was clear. They had failed him as a customer, and more importantly, they had failed the very principles he had built his company on. Once he finished the email, He read it over one last time before hitting send. There was no going back now, the ball was in motion. He stood up straight and walked toward his car, feeling a sense of calm wash over him, as if the decision he had made had already set things in motion, things he knew would lead to real change. He wasn't angry anymore, not in the way he had been earlier. He was determined, he had a plan, and he was going to see it through no matter the cost. He drove back to his office in silence, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just done. But he knew this was only the beginning. Soon the dealership would know who he really was, and when that moment came, he was ready to face it. He wasn't going to let them get away with this kind of behavior, not after everything he had worked for, and not after everything he knew the company stood for. The idea of treating everyone with dignity and respect had been the cornerstone of his business, and he wasn't going to let a few arrogant employees tarnish that reputation. When he arrived at his office, he went straight to his desk and checked his inbox. The response came almost immediately from his senior management team, and the dealership's owner. Both were alarmed and deeply concerned by his account of what had happened. They promised to look into the situation and vowed to take swift action. Marcus nodded to himself as he read their responses, knowing that this wasn't just about holding a few employees accountable. This was about changing the culture of the dealership and ensuring that it aligned with the values he had built his company on. He spent the next few hours preparing for the inevitable meeting with the dealership staff. He had no idea how they would react when they found out who he really was, but he knew one thing for sure: it was going to be a moment they would never forget, and that was exactly the point. As the hours passed, Marcus's anticipation only grew. He sat at his desk, carefully reviewing the recorded interactions and reflecting on what had happened earlier that day. He knew the staff at the dealership would be blindsided when they found out who he really was, but he didn't care. This wasn't about revenge. It was about change. It was about ensuring that no one else would walk into that dealership and experience what he had just endured. He couldn't let it slide, because he knew the truth was that the culture there wasn't just wrong, it was toxic, and it needed to be addressed now before it could spread further. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly time for the meeting he had called with the dealership owner and senior management. They were all expecting him to lead the charge, but Marcus wasn't sure how it would unfold. He had been in the position of power for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable, to have the tables turned. But today he would walk into that room with his head held high. He had nothing to hide, nothing to apologize for. He was simply doing what needed to be done. His phone buzzed with a message from the dealership owner, confirming that everyone had gathered for the meeting. The time had come. Marcus stood up from his desk and grabbed his jacket. Before heading to the elevator, he walked through the lobby with purpose, his mind focused on the task ahead. He couldn't afford to let his nerves get the best of him. He had a responsibility to the company and to the people who relied on him to do the right thing. As the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Marcus stepped out and made his way to the conference room. He could hear the low murmur of voices inside and knew that the staff was already there waiting for him. The moment of truth had arrived. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room fell silent. The staff looked up at him, some faces full of curiosity, others already looking guilty as they tried to piece together why they had been summoned to this meeting. Marcus wasted no time. He walked to the head of the table and took a seat without saying a word. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking, his voice calm and steady. "This morning I walked into your dealership as a customer," he began, his words cutting through the tension in the room. "I came in looking to purchase a car like any other person would, but instead of being treated like a valued customer, I was ignored, dismissed, and made to feel as though I didn't belong." The staff exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke. Marcus continued, his gaze unwavering as he spoke. "What happened to me today is not just a reflection of poor customer service, it's a reflection of the culture you've allowed to exist within this dealership, a culture that judges people based on the color of their skin or their appearance rather than their potential or their ability to be a loyal customer, and that culture has no place in my company." The room was still. No one moved. Marcus could feel the weight of his words sinking in. They hadn't yet realized the full gravity of the situation. but they would soon enough. He paused for a moment before continuing. You see, I wasn't just a customer today, I am the CEO of this company, and I have been watching everything you've done and everything you failed to do. I have the recordings of your interactions with me and with other customers, and I can assure you that I will not stand by while this kind of behavior continues. There was a collective gasp around the table, some faces turning pale, others shifting uncomfortably as the reality of who they were sitting in front of began to set in. Marcus sat back in his chair and waited for their response. But deep down, he already knew what was coming. This meeting was just the beginning. The silence in the room was suffocating as the staff stared at Marcus. Some were in shock, others looked like they had been caught in the act and had no way to defend themselves. Marcus could feel their eyes on him. But he didn't flinch, he held his ground and waited for someone to speak. The dealership owner was the first to recover, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice shaky as he addressed Marcus. Mr. Thompson, this is a misunderstanding, I assure you. The owner began, his eyes darting around the room, as if looking for support from the others. The staff here, they are good people. This must be some kind of mistake. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he studied the owner's reaction. He had heard these kinds of excuses before, the same ones people used when they were caught in the act of discrimination. It was always the same line, this wasn't intentional. We didn't mean to offend. But Marcus knew better. He had seen enough to know that this was not a mistake. This was a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to persist unchecked for far too long. This isn't a mistake, Marcus said, his voice unwavering. This is a pattern of behavior that has been tolerated and encouraged by poor leadership and a lack of accountability. Your employees weren't just rude to me, they were rude to every customer they deemed unworthy of their attention, and that is the problem I am here to fix. The room was still as the weight of his words settled in. No one moved, no one spoke. They all sat there frozen, some of them already starting to understand the severity of the situation and what it would mean for them moving forward. The dealership owner looked defeated, his shoulders slumped as if the fight had already left him. But he wasn't ready to give up yet. He took a deep breath and glanced at the staff as if searching for a lifeline. Marcus, please, this can't be how things go. We can work this out. We'll train the staff, we'll make changes, but firing everyone right now, that's extreme, the owner pleaded. But Marcus didn't flinch. You don't get to make excuses for people who are actively harming your business, Marcus replied. This is about much more than customer service. This is about respect. This is about creating an environment where people of all backgrounds are treated equally, not just the ones who fit your narrow view of what a customer should look like. The staff began to shift in their seats, some of them clearly uncomfortable with what was happening, while others sat silently, their eyes cast downward, as if they could somehow avoid the confrontation. Marcus wasn't interested in their discomfort, though he was focused on the bigger picture. We are going to start over, Marcus said firmly. This dealership will undergo a complete overhaul. We'll start with diversity and inclusion training, and we will ensure that no one is treated the way I was treated today. I won't stand for it, and neither should you. Marcus turned his gaze to the staff, who were now visibly nervous, their faces a mix of guilt and fear. He could see them looking around at one another, wondering what would happen next. But Marcus had already made up his mind. They had all failed to live up to the standards he set for his company, and they would all face the consequences. You will all be let go, Marcus said, his voice calm but filled with finality. And we will rebuild this team from the ground up. I'm sorry, but I can't allow this behavior to continue under any circumstances. The shock was palpable. Some of the staff began to protest, while others sat in stunned silence as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. But Marcus didn't let their protests sway him. He had made his decision, and there was no going back. The room erupted into chaos as the staff reacted to Marcus's announcement. Some of them started talking over each other, others stood up in disbelief, shaking their heads as if they couldn't comprehend what was happening. One by one, they tried to justify their actions, pleading for another chance. Some of them even tried to convince the dealership owner to intervene, but he was silent, his face pale and his eyes downcast. He knew better than anyone that Marcus wasn't the type to back down. Not when he had already made up his mind. The reality of the situation was settling in for everyone in that room. The atmosphere had shifted from tense silence to desperate pleading, and Marcus wasn't moved by any of it. Please, Marcus, you don't understand. One of the salespeople, a middle aged man with thinning hair, stood up, his voice cracking with frustration. We were just doing our jobs. We didn't mean to treat you differently. I swear this wasn't personal. Marcus's gaze turned cold as he locked eyes with the man. It wasn't personal to you, but it was to me. It was personal to me when I walked in and was completely ignored because of the way I looked. It was personal when I was made to feel like I wasn't worth your time. He paused, his voice growing firmer. This is about more than just sales. It's about how you treat people. And clearly, you don't know how to treat people who don't fit your narrow definition of what a customer should be. The man opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The reality of his actions and words seemed to finally hit him like a wave, and for the first time he looked ashamed. He sat back down and fell silent. The other staff members were quieter now, their earlier protests dying down into uncomfortable silence, but the damage had already been done. They all knew what was coming next. The tension in the room grew thicker. As Marcus waited for their next move, none of them spoke again. As he turned his attention to the dealership owner, who had been sitting there motionless for several minutes, he was avoiding Marcus's gaze, but Marcus wasn't letting him off the hook so easily. You allowed this to happen, Marcus said, his voice low, but filled with authority. You turned a blind eye to your staff's behavior, and now you want to pretend it wasn't your responsibility. I can't have someone like you running a business that reflects my values. The owner shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly overwhelmed, but Marcus wasn't going to soften his stance. He wasn't interested in excuses this time. The dealership was going to be held accountable, no matter how hard it was going to be for those involved. We're done here, Marcus said, finally breaking the silence. I don't want to hear any more excuses. I don't care about the reasons you have for this behavior. The reality is this dealership has failed at its core, and I won't allow it to continue under these conditions. He stood up and glanced at each of the employees. One last time, some were still in disbelief, others had their heads hung low. But none of them spoke up anymore. They understood the gravity of the situation now, and Marcus wasn't about to backtrack. He had made his decision, and there was no room for negotiation. You'll all be escorted out of the building, Marcus said coldly, and I'll be working with HR to ensure a proper transition. We'll rebuild this team and make sure this never happens again. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked out of the room, leaving the stunned silence behind him. As he made his way to his office, he knew that the storm he had just unleashed would have ripple effects throughout the company, but he also knew that this was necessary for change. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a step in the right direction, and he was ready to face whatever came next. As Marcus entered his office, he closed the door behind him and took a deep breath. The weight of what had just transpired was settling in, but he didn't allow himself to dwell on it. He had made the right decision, he was sure of that. But even the right decisions came with consequences. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for his HR director. The phone rang a few times before someone picked up. Marcus, the HR director said, her voice cautious. Are you okay? We just heard what happened. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him. I'm fine, he said, his tone calm but firm. I need you to start preparing for a full staff overhaul at the dealership. We need to bring in new people who understand the values that this company stands for. I want new hiring protocols in place, and we need to get diversity and inclusion training underway immediately. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Before she spoke again, understood, I'll start coordinating with the recruiting team right away. We'll make sure the new hires align with your vision for the company. Good, Marcus replied, his eyes scanning the view from his office window. Make it happen quickly. I don't want any more delays. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, his mind already racing to the next steps. He had a lot of work ahead of him, and the road to real change wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for it. He had been through much harder battles in his career, and this was just another challenge he would face head-on. As the day wore on, Marcus's inbox began to fill with messages from his team. Some were congratulatory, others were filled with concern, but all of them acknowledged the bold move he had made. Marcus didn't respond to most of them just yet. He needed time to think. But one message stood out. It was from the dealership owner. He hadn't heard from him since the meeting, and he was curious to see what the owner had to say. He opened the email and began reading it carefully. The owner was apologetic, his words filled with regret, as he expressed his disappointment in the staff's behavior and promised to work alongside Marcus to ensure that the changes he was demanding could take place. The message was long, but ultimately it boiled down to one thing: the owner was trying to salvage his position and the reputation of the dealership, but Marcus wasn't sure it was enough to make him change his mind. Marcus sat back in his chair, considering the message for a few moments before he typed out a brief response. "Thank you for your message, but the changes need to go beyond words. They need to be reflected in actions. I expect immediate steps to be taken to implement the new policies we discussed, and I will be following up regularly to ensure they are being followed." He sent the email and closed his laptop before turning his attention to the next task at hand. There was a lot of work to do, and the team he was about to rebuild needed guidance. Marcus knew he had to lead by example. If he was going to make real change happen, it was going to take time, but it was necessary if the company was to thrive in the way he had always envisioned. As the evening approached, Marcus stood up and looked out the window of his office. The city lights were starting to flicker on. As the sun began to set, he thought about the road ahead, the battles he would face, and the resistance he might encounter. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't afraid of the fight. In fact, he welcomed it because he knew that sometimes change required bold actions and sacrifices, and he was more than willing to make both if it meant creating a better future for everyone involved. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity for Marcus as he dove into the task of rebuilding the dealership from the ground up. He spent countless hours working with HR to implement new hiring protocols. He met with the marketing team to craft an inclusive brand message, and he worked with the training department to design an intensive diversity and inclusion program that would be mandatory for all employees. It was a massive undertaking, but Marcus knew it had to be done, and he wasn't willing to settle for anything less than complete transformation. Each day brought new challenges as he worked tirelessly to hold everyone accountable, from the dealership owner to the lowest-ranking employee. He made it clear that no one was exempt from the changes that were coming. They would either adapt or be left behind. The dealership was going to be a place where every customer felt welcome and valued, no matter their race, gender, or background. Marcus wasn't going to stop until that vision became a reality. As the weeks went on, Marcus began to see the effects of his actions in small but significant ways. The new hires brought fresh energy and enthusiasm to the dealership. They were eager to learn and genuinely committed to making the business a place where people could come and feel respected. The old employees who had been a part of the toxic culture slowly started to filter out. Many of them left voluntarily, knowing they couldn't meet the new standards Marcus had set, but some of them fought back. They tried to argue their case to the dealership owner, but Marcus had already made it clear that there was no room for compromise. They either followed the new rules or they were out. By the end of the month, Marcus could feel a noticeable shift in the dealership's atmosphere. The tension that had once filled the air was replaced by a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. The staff worked together more efficiently. They were genuinely interested in serving customers, and it showed in the way they treated everyone who walked through the doors. Customers began to take notice of the changes as well, and the dealership's reputation started to improve. New reviews flooded in praising the friendly, knowledgeable staff and the inclusive environment that had been established. It wasn't long before Marcus received a call from one of the top executives at a major automotive group. They had heard about the changes at the dealership and wanted to discuss a potential partnership. Marcus wasn't surprised. He knew that word of the transformation would get around. But what surprised him was how quickly it had all come together in such a short amount of time. He knew he had made the right decision, and now he was seeing the rewards of his efforts firsthand. As he sat in his office that evening looking over the latest performance reports, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had taken a massive risk by confronting the dealership's toxic culture head on. And although it hadn't been easy, he knew it had been necessary. The road ahead was still long, and there was still much to be done, but for the first time in a while he felt like he was truly making a difference. He wasn't just building a business, he was building something that aligned with his values, something that would stand as a testament to what could be achieved when people were treated with respect and dignity. He leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. The journey was far from over, but Marcus was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. Weeks turned into months, and Marcus watched as the dealership continued to thrive under the new leadership. The changes he had implemented were no longer just ideas on paper, they were living, breathing examples of how a business could succeed by prioritizing respect, fairness, and inclusion. The staff morale was at an all-time high, and the customers continued to pour in, eager to experience the new atmosphere Marcus had created. Every day brought new opportunities to improve, and Marcus made sure to seize every one of them, whether it was updating the customer service process or introducing new community outreach initiatives. He never lost sight of the core values that had guided him throughout his career. The partnership with the major automotive group came through exactly as Marcus had hoped. It was the kind of collaboration that would take the dealership to new heights and open doors to even more opportunities. Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The dealership had the potential to expand into other cities and reach even more people. But he wasn't going to rush it. He wanted to make sure that the foundation was solid before moving forward with any major expansions. He had learned the hard way that true success couldn't be built on a shaky foundation. It needed to be built on trust, mutual respect, and the willingness to do what was right even when it wasn't easy. One afternoon, Marcus received a call from a longtime friend and mentor who had been following his progress from afar. Marcus, his mentor, said, "I've been hearing a lot about the work you're doing at the dealership, and I have to say I'm impressed. You've turned things around in a way I didn't think was possible." Marcus smiled a little at the praise, but he knew better than to take all the credit. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "It was the entire team. We all worked together to make it happen, and the customers have been incredibly supportive too. I couldn't have done it without them." "That's exactly what makes you a great leader," Marcus, his mentor, said. "You understand that success isn't about doing it all on your own, it's about bringing people along with you and empowering them to succeed alongside you." Marcus leaned back in his chair, reflecting on his mentor's words. It was true. He couldn't have done any of this alone. It had taken a collective effort from everyone involved: the new hires, the staff who had embraced the changes, the customers who had shown their support, and even the competitors who had watched with interest to see how it would all play out. Marcus had managed to create an environment where people felt valued and respected, and that had made all the difference. But Marcus knew there was still more work to be done. There would always be more work to be done. The world wasn't perfect, and the business landscape was constantly shifting. There would always be new challenges to face and new obstacles to overcome. But Marcus was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. He had learned that leadership wasn't about avoiding challenges, it was about meeting them head on and doing everything in his power to turn them into opportunities for growth. As he sat in his office that evening watching the sunset over the city, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace. He had made the right decision all those months ago when he had walked into that dealership and demanded change. He had stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult, and now he was seeing the fruits of his labor. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition, it was about knowing he had made a real difference in the lives of others, and for Marcus that was more than enough. He looked out the window one last time before turning off his desk lamp and heading home for the night. Tomorrow was another day full of opportunities, and Marcus was ready for whatever it had in store.